Hello, this is Scott Montgomery of the Small Town Mercer. Lately today, I've been seeing that there's been a lot of comparisons between Bitcoin and the Tulip mania going on um, back in the early 17th century in the Netherlands. And I have to say, I have to state unequivocally that I don't see much of a comparison because Bitcoin is not a commodity, it's an asset. Tulips are an asset. Oil and Bitcoin and finance and money and gold and things like that to me are assets. Um, Tulips and any kind of good, roses, vegetables, those are commodities to me. Wheat, you know, there's in my mind, there's no comparison. Bitcoin will never go back down to zero. It's a whole new technology. And so today I thought I'd talk about the Dutch stock market and the Dutch and their financing and all of that. Their company, the VOC, the United East India Company, and just how big it was and how successful they were. And they were so successful that they basically almost outlived the Netherlands themselves, or at least the way the Netherlands was set up back then as a colonizer. So the VOC is going to start in 1602, and that's their logo. They're the first ever corporate logo, I believe, in the world. At least the first one in the Western world that I know of. So anyway, so they're going to get started. This company is going to last roughly 200 years. They'll be dissolved on New Year's Day of 1800, and largely taken over by the Dutch government at that point. But at the time, this company and this stock market is going to revolutionize the world, so much so that we're still using that stock market system today as I make this video. Wall Street uses everything that the Dutch did. So that was developed right then and there. And there's a reason for that. All right. As a matter of fact, the Dutch stock market was not only open to the Dutch, and it was not open to necessarily nobility, but it was open to all people, mostly artisan craftsmen and primarily merchants. I would say virtually all of them were merchants. And not only were they Dutch, but they were from the German states, the Italian city states, Portugal, even some English, some French, and a host of other nations were able to invest in the stock market. They were so successful by 1611, they raised about $110 million worth, which I forget how many guilders, there's 8 million guilders. So maybe more. But they were very, very successful. By the 1630s, I think 1637, a lot of people claim that they were worth roughly $8 trillion in today's money. How big is that? Well, it would be the equivalent of the top 20 companies in the world today in the year 2021. All of them combined. Or if you combine the GDP of Germany and Japan, two top 10 world economies, it would still, I think, not quite equal how big this company was in 1637. That's how successful they were. No one company has ever reached this figure. And they did it back in the 1600s. All right, so let's talk about them for a while. And we'll get to the tulip mania. I'll mention that a little bit. But what was so special about their stock market? Not only that it was open to everyone, but remember, a lot of mercantilistic nations had royalty back then, kings and lords and what have you, coming out of the feudal system. And they still had that. So their idea was the lords and the nobility would basically be generators of wealth, and they would head up the army, they would head up the government, they would head up everything. And other than maybe England, who had a parliament, most countries did not have necessarily a parliament. Some did, I think. Some did have some sort of democratic leadership, but I think France is going to experiment in that. But prior to that, but England, pretty much the Dutch at this point are much more, I would say, middle class heavy. The Dutch don't have that system, and there's a reason for that. If we go back into the Dutch history right before their company and their stock market came about, the Dutch are going to have a lot of advantages, and there are reasons why that they are not necessarily a nobility. Obviously, if you look at the country, those are the low lands. They were half those lands were in the sea, and they were marshy lands, kind of like if you've been to Florida. I would think that the Netherlands, though, would experience a little more flooding than that back early on. And so this was an area that was largely tied to the Germanic states, Denmark, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands. But the Netherlands is kind of like that border between Germany and France, they and Belgium. Belgium is a little more French, and the Netherlands is a little more Germanic, but they have large French influences in those societies, so they're not quite Germanic. And also, they were largely controlled by French lords prior to the Spanish acquiring them. Now remember, Spain and all the Catholic countries at this time are going to be united in the Austrian Empire, which was known as the Holy Roman Empire, which would have included the papacy. All right? So these are all the Catholic states, all the Catholic countries. England is going to be separate from that. During I would say about 50 or so years prior to the formation of the Dutch East India Company, that's when you had the Protestant Reformation going on with Martin Luther. So the Netherlands and some of these other Germanic influenced states are going to be influenced by that. They're going to start to be Protestant. Then you'll even have a movement in France called the Huguenots, and they will also be Protestant. And they will be allied with England. So anyway, so that's how the Dutch are going to be about. They're kind of thrown into the Holy Roman Empire. At this time, it's being ruled by King Philip of Spain. So essentially, because of a marriage in the Habsburgs family, King Philip is now in charge of the Netherlands, and they don't like that. And the reason they don't like that is because the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to have a somewhat of a civil war going on, and that's going to be settled with the Portuguese joining Spain. And they're going to cut out the Dutch. Now, the Dutch, because of their proximity, they're a seafaring country. They're not really a land-faring country, much like the English. And so the Dutch have already been sailing. They've been hired out to carry loads for the Portuguese and the Spanish, because the Portuguese and the Spanish have been fighting wars not only with each other, but with the Muslims because of the trade route going all the way to the East Asia. But also, they're fighting the English in the North and South American continents, right? So that's going on. So the Spanish and the Portuguese are not able to keep up their shipment and keep up the expeditions to East Asia and the Asian continent and the islands, the Pacific Islands. So the Dutch are going to help out, and they're going to basically carry them for. Now, once the Portuguese and the Dutch were highly competitive, they didn't want the Dutch doing this for them, but the Spanish Um, and the Portuguese, part of their treaty, I think, is to exclude the Dutch. And so the Dutch now want to have their independence. They want to be their own independent state. And before they're able to achieve that, because they don't have the money or the resources, and because all of the Netherlands is made up of originally the lowland countries were made up of 17 districts. Now 12 of them are in the Netherlands, and so those were basically they were all competing against one another. And now during this time, um, the Dutch are going to try to form a government and fight for their independence. And so these regents are going to be running things and form a government. But what they're going to do is they're going to allow the Dutch East India Company to largely be their own entity. So, in other words, they have their own shipbuilding, they have their own army, they can even coin their own money, and they're in charge of all the spices and they're in charge of all the stocks. So, how this works is they're going to set up this stock market with these investors, and then they're going to pay these things called, they're going to sell these things called shares. And shares, you can either hold shares or you could sell shares. Now remember, shares are an asset. They're not a commodity, and I think a lot of people don't understand that. And the reason I say that is because you can also borrow against them. And that's what people don't understand. You hear this all the time. You say, wow, the rich don't pay taxes. Well, they profit from every move in the stock market. Blah, 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 right? Um, well, that's true, but it's also false. But since you've got these three options, you can also do things like short sell and buy back. In other words, when the price drops, you can sell, or if you see the price dropping, you can sell. Wait till it drops even further, and then as it settles down, you could buy it back, and then maybe it'll make its way back up again. You can hold, and when the price goes down, you could just hold and then buy more. That's a strategy that I like because I don't spend a lot of money at one time when I buy assets, shares or coins or whatever. That's what I do. And then if you have enough of them, you can borrow against them and pay back the interest and not really lose your asset. It's like borrowing against your house. You get a second mortgage and what have you. So that's those are things that they developed. Now during the tulip mania in Holland, people were doing a lot of short selling and borrowing against the assets because the tulip kept going up and up and up because it was such a rare and exotic flower that everybody wanted one, and it got really hot and heavy and they got over speculated. As you know, it's kind of like a pyramid scheme, and then eventually, it kind of peters out because people realize it's too expensive, it's getting too expensive, so then the price falls. And when the price falls, you have a lot of panic selling. And so then you have a market failure because of over speculation. Well, here's the difference. The Dutch major commodity back in the day were spices. That's how they made their money. All right? Spices. That's how they made their money. And so it was quickly and easily, the Dutch were quickly and easily able to rebuild their finances this way. Now, the Dutch hired a lot of navigators, mostly their own because they had been navigating. They were really good at navigating, and they were really good at shipbuilding. And at that time, they built the best ships and had the best navigators as far as a nation as a whole. And remember, the Spanish had a few, but they didn't have a lot. They would hire Italians like Christopher Columbus or Amerigo Vespucci and explorers like that to help them out. The Dutch are going to do the same thing. Out west, they're going to send Henry Hudson, who's an Englishman, and Hudson Bay and the Hudson River are named after him. And I think, is Verrazano going to sail for them? I'm not sure. But another Italian. But anyway, not sure if he is or not, because I know he sailed for the Spaniards, or the Portuguese, I'm sorry. But I'm not sure if he sailed for the Dutch eventually or not. I'd have to look that up. And regardless, you had a lot of Dutch. They were really good at this. So they would go to places like Japan and get silver from Japan. They would trade spices for silver. Then they would go to China and maybe trade some of the spices and silver for porcelain. Then they would go to, or silk, and then they would go to India and get teas and things like that, and other commodities. I'm not sure if they had sugar then or not. But anyway, by the time they got back to the Netherlands, they had spices, they had silks, they had porcelain, they had silver, they had a bunch of things. And eventually they're going to trade slaves. You know, the Muslims right now are in control of that, but they're going to get involved in that as well. And they're also going to eventually attack and colonize those areas and imprison them and enslave the natives over there as well. They're going to go to South Africa and they're going to start agricultural farming on the tip of South Africa. That's called Cape Town. And one of the other commodities they're going to make there is wine, believe it or not. So they're going to be a very wealthy company. As time goes on, they're going to use all these investing tricks to further enhance their value. The stock market is going to be a very successful operation, and they're going to make a lot of wealth. And like I said, it's going to last almost 200 years. And the reason that the VOC was so important to me is not so much that they were able to corner the market on a lot of products that Europeans wanted: linens, porcelain, hard money, silver, spices, agricultural goods, wine, and all these things. The reason they were able to do that is because they had a vibrant market that was always pushing capital. You see the stock market today. Right now it's somewhere around 30,000, I think 31,000. It was up to 32,000, I think, before Trump left. Somewhere around there. And we're in the early stages of the Biden presidency. So we're still kind of running off the Trump fumes, I think. But whatever, it is what it is. I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm just saying that currently it's still up in that rafter. Maybe 6 months from now it'll go up even higher. Maybe it won't. I don't know. But that's where it is today, and it's a very high value. And those are the Dow components. But here, because of these market strategies, we're able to keep the capital going. Because remember, the Netherlands has only 1.5 million people, and it's largely a merchant society. So they're more of a democratic society. Not completely, but they're more of one than the mercantilistic nations. So that's more of a restrictive state capitalism, state-run capital, almost like a socialist system. But the Dutch are a little bit more free market than that. So they're able to trade freely. They're really good at shipbuilding, and they're able to invest their money on, for the first time ever, in infrastructure projects. So obviously when you go to the Netherlands, one of the more famous things you're going to see are what? Those windmills, right? Well, they're there because they're reclaiming their lands. They build up these high dikes and then have these swampy areas, these kind of, I don't know what you want to call them, little perk ponds, I guess. And they're going to drain those out and back into the ocean. So they're going to build a trench and go downhill and, send them, the windmills are going to pump them out. And they're going to reclaim their land that way. And those barrier islands are going to prevent future flooding from the ocean from coming in. So that's that's how they've done it, and they're going to be able to build their cities over these canals that pump the water out. Like the Amstel River and what have you, and all these other little canals that go through places like Amsterdam and what have you. So they're able to build right over the top of them these little bridges and these little overhangs where even buildings are going to lay on top of these, like the Dutch stock market did. So anyway, so that's a little lesson on the Dutch stock market and why I think that Bitcoin is not going to go the way of the tulip. It's just not, because these investment strategies are into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is an asset, much like the spices and all the products that the Dutch used were an asset and were able to be converted into money. And tulips are not money. I mean, they were considered like money when they were hot, but eventually the real money took over. I think that's what's going to be the case with Bitcoin. Bitcoin, there's a finite amount of it. It's always going to hold its value. It's not like a fiat currency. To me, the fiat currency is more like the tulip than Bitcoin or than cryptocurrency, whatever cryptocurrencies, Ethereum, Cardano, whatever the Binance coin, whatever the big ones are now. So anyway, that is my lecture for today. I have another lecture that I've done already that's going to talk about the tech differences between modern technology that we know of today, the year 2020, 2021, versus the coming technology of cryptocurrency. So look forward to that. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day. This is Scott Montgomery of the Small Town Mercer.